All right, let's dive right into the COP29 climate summit in Baku, Azerbaijan. This one was a real whirlwind, wasn't it? We're going to help you try to figure out what actually happened there.
Yeah, for sure. The headlines, they were kind of all over the place. Everything from trillion-dollar victory to straight up betrayal, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's easy to get lost in all of it.
Yeah, it is. And especially with all this information coming from all these different sources like The Guardian and Al Jazeera, and even like reports coming from Italian and German outlets.
Yeah, so we've got like a whole stack of reports here.
Oh, yeah.
And our mission today is to figure out, was this summit actually a win for the planet? Or was this, just another round of all that political maneuvering? But more importantly, we got to figure out what it all means for the future, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a great place to start would be with that really eye-popping figure that everyone keeps talking about,
Yeah.
$300 billion.
Yeah.
That's the annual amount pledged by 2035 to help developing nations fight climate change.
Yeah. That's, more than triple the last commitment.
It is.
That sounds, kind of promising, but
Yeah.
is it actually going to be enough?
Well, I guess it really just depends on who you ask, right?
Right.
Developed nations are really touting it as this major step forward,
Right.
saying it's, the absolute most they can offer right now.
Hmm.
However, a lot of developing countries are calling it just a drop in the bucket,
Yeah.
especially since they initially requested $1.3 trillion.
So a pretty huge gap between what's actually needed and what's being offered.
Yeah, for sure.
I can definitely see why some nations might be calling this whole thing a betrayal.
Yeah, imagine, you're this small island nation facing, like, rising sea levels.
Yeah.
And you're told that a small, tiny fraction of what you need is all they can afford. The reports from The Guardian really highlighted that tension.
Right.
And even described how some negotiators from these vulnerable nations, they walked out in protest.
Yeah, those walkouts, they really speak volumes. It sounds like these countries just felt completely unheard and just disregarded.
Exactly. And it really raises this big question of fairness in these big negotiations,
Right.
These smaller, often poorer countries, they have way more limited resources to, participate in these really long sessions.
Right.
While larger, wealthier nations can just kind of like outlast them.
It's like a war of attrition. That's how they described it, right?
Yeah.
Panama's negotiator, Juan Carlos Monterrey Gomez, even spoke about that intense psychological pressure.
Right. It's not all about the money.
Right.
It's about, having a real voice in decisions that directly impact their future.
Oh, yeah.
Definitely.
So it sounds like the power dynamics at play here are incredibly complex.
They are, absolutely. And it even goes beyond the negotiations.
Oh.
Yeah, even the choice of Azerbaijan, a country with, a significant stake in oil and gas,
right,
as the host for this summit, it really raises some eyebrows,
That's a really interesting point. And the Guardian actually mentioned, that heavy presence of fossil fuel interests at the summit. So do you think that influenced the outcomes in any way?
It's really hard to say for sure.
Right.
But the Guardian report points out some, concerning things. Like, for example, Saudi Arabia allegedly tried to weaken the language around phasing out fossil fuels,
Oh, okay.
And then, they really ruffled some feathers when a Saudi official tried to actually alter a key text without consulting everyone.
Wow, talk about a power play.
Right?
That raises some big questions about who's actually in charge here, who's driving this whole thing.
Yeah. These incidents really highlight a tension between the urgent need to address climate change and the powerful economic interests tied to fossil fuels.
Right.
It kind of makes you wonder, who benefits most from delaying action and how much influence do these lobbies actually have on global policy?
It's definitely something to think about, especially as we dive deeper into this whole agreement. Like, one thing that I thought was interesting is that China is just being encouraged to contribute. There's no real obligation, even though they are the world's largest emitter.
Right. That's a good point.
Begs the question, what does this mean for global cooperation? Are we seeing some kind of shift in responsibility? Or is it just another example of wealthier nations trying to pass the buck?
Yeah, definitely something to keep in mind as we move beyond just the headlines and start unpacking the details of this deal.
All right, so let's dive into those details.
Let's do it.
Shall we?
Yeah. One of the things that really stands out to me is just how vague this agreement is on, where the money is coming from for that $300 billion.
Right, yeah. It doesn't say if it's from like public funds or private investments or, some kind of combo of both.
Right, exactly. And that makes a huge difference, doesn't it?
It really does, yeah.
Like relying mostly on private investments, that raises a whole lot of concerns about, accountability.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And will the money even get to the people who need it?
Right.
It also, makes you think about who's profiting from these investments.
Yeah, exactly.
Are we talking about, actual sustainable development that actually helps communities?
Right.
Or are we just creating new markets for corporations to exploit?
The Guardian did touch on that a bit.
They did.
They mentioned like a $1.3 trillion overall target that includes things like maybe taxing fossil fuels and even frequent flyers.
Yeah, that's right. The idea is to generate revenue by taxing things that, contribute to climate change.
Right. But is that even realistic? I mean, who ends up paying for all of that?
Mm-hmm.
Would these levies actually reduce emissions, or would it just make like travel and energy more expensive for everybody?
These are all good questions. It's easy to just look at the big numbers and get excited.
Right.
But, we always got to look at the details, like who pays, who profits, and who gets left behind.
Yeah, for sure. Those are crucial things to think about.
And it's not just about the money.
No, it's not.
The human cost of climate change, especially in places that are already dealing with conflict, is something that, really stood out in these reports.
Absolutely. Like the situation in Palestine,
Right.
and especially Gaza,
Yeah.
is just this really stark reminder that, climate change doesn't happen in a vacuum,
Right.
It intersects with inequalities and conflicts, and it often makes them even worse.
Yeah, the reports, especially from Al Jazeera, really highlighted the devastating impact of that conflict with Israel on the environment and the people living there.
It's awful.
Damaged agricultural land, contaminated water, energy scarcity. These are just some of the challenges they face.
It's heartbreaking. One quote from The Guardian really stuck with me. This Palestinian official, Ahmed Abu Thaher, he said, "If you're killing the people there, then who are you trying to protect the environment for?"
Wow, that's a really powerful question.
It is, right?
It makes you think about, who are we really protecting when we're talking about climate action?
Yes.
Exactly. And who might be left out.
Yeah. Some reports even use the term ecocide to describe what's happening in Gaza, highlighting the deliberate destruction of the environment because of this conflict.
It's a really sobering thought that climate change isn't just about glaciers melting and sea levels rising. It's about people and their lives and their right to a healthy environment.
Yeah, absolutely. It shows how interconnected these global issues are, We can't just talk about climate change without also talking about things like conflict and poverty, social justice, and human rights.
They're all tied together, right?
Yeah, they really are.
And the reports also mentioned these calls for a fuel embargo on Israel and taking a closer look at what role fossil fuel companies are playing in supplying oil to the region.
It's such a complicated issue, and it brings up some really tough questions. On the one hand, we desperately need to transition away from fossil fuels, to stop climate change.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, there's these ongoing conflicts that rely on fossil fuels for energy security.
It's like we're stuck between a rock and a hard place.
Kinda, yeah.
But just ignoring it isn't going to make it go away, right?
Exactly. We have to have these hard conversations, even if they're uncomfortable, and try to figure out solutions that, address both the urgent needs and the long-term goal of a sustainable and just future.
So after looking at all these details, where do we stand? I mean, this $300 billion commitment is a good start.
It is.
But there's still so many questions that haven't been answered.
Yeah, it's important to remember that these international agreements are just, starting points. They're not the finish line.
Right, right.
The real work starts now, holding leaders accountable for these financial commitments and pushing for even more ambitious action.
The reports did highlight some positive stuff, like the agreement to create a global carbon market, Article 6.
Yes, Article 6 that lets countries trade emissions credits.
So is that a good thing?
It's controversial, it's got potential benefits, but also risks.
Okay, so it's not like a perfect solution.
No, it's a complex tool that we have to watch very carefully, make sure it actually leads to less emissions and not just accounting loopholes.
Right, right. We need to be careful about how this market develops and make sure it helps create a just and equitable transition and not just corporate profits.
Exactly. And speaking of roadblocks, there's another big one we have to talk about.
Yep.
Trump being back in the White House?
Oh, yeah, right.
That was a big topic during the summit,
It was, yeah.
A lot of people are worried because of what he's done before. That he'll actually try to block progress instead of supporting climate action.
Yeah, I mean, his skepticism toward climate change is well known, so him being reelected definitely adds another layer of, uncertainty to this whole global climate fight.
Definitely. It just reminds us how important political will is in tackling this whole crisis. Domestic politics have a huge impact on international agreements.
Yeah. So it sounds like this COP29 deal is just one piece of this big, complicated puzzle.
It really is.
We've got financial commitments that aren't enough, powerful people trying to keep things the same, and political uncertainty that could derail everything. It's like a lot to take in. So before we wrap things up, let's look at the global reaction. How did the world respond to all of this? So we've got this complicated agreement and so many unanswered questions. How did the world react to, this final COP29 deal? Was there any hope, or was it mostly doom and gloom?
It was really a mix of both, I guess, as you'd expect with something this big and complicated.
Yeah.
Some people saw that $300 billion commitment and thought, oh, this is good, a positive step. Even called it an important down payment on a more equitable future.
Yeah, that sounds like Anidas Gupta from the World Resources Institute.
Yeah.
He was a little bit more optimistic, I think, than others.
Yeah, and, he's right. It's definitely a step in the right direction, but there were a lot of people who weren't happy at all. And, I mean, they had a good reason to be. Mohammed Adaw, he's from the Power Shift Africa think tank, and he just straight up called it a disaster for the developing world and a betrayal of, people and the planet.
Wow.
Yeah.
That really highlights that sense of injustice that, we talked about earlier.
Yeah, it really does. It shows how frustrated people are, especially those who are dealing with climate change right now. They're already seeing the consequences.
Right, and there was a lot of criticism aimed at Azerbaijan.
Oh, yeah.
For being the host.
Right. A lot of people felt like choosing a country that makes most of its money from oil and gas just sends, the wrong signal.
Yeah.
Were they worried that the fossil fuel industry would try to, influence the negotiations right from the start?
Right, and The Guardian even reported that Saudi Arabia tried to, water down those commitments to, phasing out fossil fuels.
Yeah.
It's a good reminder that these negotiations aren't just about good intentions.
No, they're not.
There are some really powerful groups trying to keep things exactly the same.
Right. And those groups, they're going to keep being a factor in these future climate talks. It's this constant battle between what's good for the planet and what's good for certain industries.
So as we, finish up this whole deep dive into COP29, what are the big takeaways for, our listeners? What should people be thinking about, when they hear news about climate change?
I hope this deep dive really showed just how complicated this whole climate finance thing is. It's not just about spending money, it's about fairness and making sure those funds actually reach the people who need it the most.
And that $300 billion, while it is a lot more than before, it's still not enough, and we don't even know where it's all coming from or how it's going to be used.
Yeah, and private finance being involved makes it even more complicated. We need to be asking some tough questions about, who benefits from these investments and how do we make sure everything is transparent and people are held accountable.
And we can't just ignore the fossil fuel industry either.
No, we can't.
They're trying to weaken commitments and delay action, and that's a huge problem.
Right. We have to hold our leaders accountable and make sure they're putting the planet and people first, not profits.
And I think, the situation in Gaza really showed us that climate change doesn't just happen on its own. It's connected to things like conflict and poverty, social justice, things we don't always think about.
Yeah, that's a good point. Climate change just makes existing inequalities worse, so any solutions we come up with have to address all of those things together.
So it's like this really complex situation with a lot of challenges and unknowns.
Yeah, it is.
But, it's not all bad news either. There are people everywhere fighting for change. They're pushing for action and demanding a, just and fair transition to a more sustainable future.
Right, and it's important to remember that we all can play our part. Staying informed and getting involved in these conversations, holding our leaders accountable, these are all really important steps.
That's a good point to wrap things up on. It's easy to get overwhelmed with all of this, but everything we do, no matter how small, can make a difference.
It can. We can't afford to just sit back and watch. The future of the planet really depends on what we do together.
And that's it for today's deep dive into COP29. We hope this gave you a better idea of what went on and all the challenges and opportunities that are ahead. So what are your takeaways? What questions are you left with? Keep thinking about this stuff and talking about it because, the future of our planet depends on it.
Yeah.
Until next time, stay curious and stay engaged.